Are we on? Okay, great. Come on in and grab a seat. It's good to see you. It is very good to be back with you tonight. Last week I was an online spectator. All right, somebody get those folks out in the lobby to come on in. All right, so how's this crowd compare to last week? A little smaller, okay.
Better looking.
All right. Well, I do appreciate Tim stepping in on fairly short notice and handling the lesson. And it is true that I told him that he could go ahead and he didn't have to do a separate lesson. He could go ahead and talk about Luke 5 because I could come back in and correct whatever, I needed to afterwards. I do need to reply to what he said about the crowd and why the crowd was there. Literally, my first thought when he said that was, yeah, folks know there's going to be a train wreck. They'll all gather together to watch. So, but that's kind of mean, and it's only mildly humorous because I know he would do such a great job. If I were really being mean, I'd tell him to go read the last verse of Luke 17, but I'm not going to do that. You guys can look that up on your own. But it was really good, and the comments and the discussion that was there was excellent. We're still going to spend some time there tonight. But before we do that, I do have a correction to Tim's sermon on Sunday, okay? If you will recall, when he was talking about the murder of the innocents, he said, we don't write Christmas carols about that. Well, there is, in fact, a Christmas carol that you have probably heard that is exactly about that. You just haven't heard the verses. You've heard the nice little cute chorus, but you haven't heard the verses because it is all about Herod the Butcher. Okay? And it's, if you recognize the title, Coventry Carol, but you may recognize the line, bye bye lee, lulay. Okay, it's also known as lulay, lulay. You've heard that chorus, and I'm not going to attempt to sing it, but Google it and look up the words. It is exactly about what Herod did and calls him out by name. And it dates from... I found references that range all the way from the 12th century to the 16th century, but apparently at one point it was part of an annual Christmas kind of pageant that was comprised of 2 or 3 different songs, and this was part of that pageant to talk about that aspect of what happened. So there is a Christmas carol, we just don't sing it, and you've probably never seen the words to it. So with that, let's go back to Luke chapter 5. Again, great points, great discussion last week about that. There are a few things that few of those points that I want to kind of nibble around tonight, as well as bring up a couple other things that you didn't talk about, that to me are also important in thinking about this tale. And I say tale, but this incident is probably a much better word. And I want to start with a question that I asked a couple of weeks ago when we kind of introduced this, and I think I might have even given it as a homework that I know nobody did. And that was pointing out the fact that this incident is often labeled by 2 or 3 different titles. Sometimes it's called the calling of the first disciples. If you're using NIV, that may be the way they've, the heading that they've attached to it. You may have a version that labels it the miraculous catch of fishes, okay, or something else related to Jesus teaching the crowd. When you look at the calling of the disciples, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all talk about the calling of Peter, John, and James, and Andrew, but Matthew and Mark don't mention this story, but Luke does. Given that we're going to speculate here a little bit, why do you suppose that Luke decided to tell this story? And or why did Mark and Matthew kind of bypass it and just talk about, Jesus called them and they picked up their nets and they followed him? Any thoughts about it? Have you ever thought about that? To me, I don't necessarily know the reason for it, but the implications of it are very meaningful to me and kind of answer some questions for me. So any thoughts about that? Okay, Jim moved his head in a way that made it look like I'm Matt. What you got?
I have a guess.
Okay.
I think maybe Luke puts it in there because there's something about it that may be appealing to the Gentile audience, whereas maybe Matthew throws in things that would appeal to the Jewish audience.
Okay.
But I'm not sure what it would be. This is just a guess.
Okay. All right. I think to me, you're on the right track. Matthew and Mark's audience are Jewish. How much do they really care about where Jesus' followers came from? They were Jewish, okay? They were Jewish fishermen, and, we know all about them. But yes, Jesus had followers. We know that wasn't, tell us that he called them and they followed him, but, that's kind of all we need to know. Luke, on the other hand, has gone to great pains to talk about, well, where did Jesus come from? Who is he descended from? And that John the Baptist character, how does he figure in? And how is it that, what's the relationship between Jesus and John? And how do they fit? And so to that audience, including in the story, well, where did his followers come from? Gentiles don't necessarily know that. Was it just... These were a bunch of, he just started teaching and folks started gathering around them and, the ones that hung around, they were the ones that, kind of hung around and stuck. And so this story does two things. It tells us where those guys came from and the circumstances of it. And to me, this is personal opinion here, is most of the religious movies that I've seen about Jesus and the calling of the disciples basically do it like Matthew and Mark do. They make it this sort of mystical thing, like Matthew and like James and John and those guys have never seen Jesus before, and he just walks by them and says something and they get up and follow him, almost like zombies. And I don't think that's accurate at all. And this story helps to show us that, they're hearing teaching. They're hearing the things that he said. And we know that some of them were disciples of John, so they've been hearing that message. And so when Jesus calls them, it's not out of the blue. It's not just this sort of random, I got you over here. I need your boat to go talk to the folks. But he's picked them. He's chosen them. But they've heard, and their hearts are inclined to follow him. Yes, Jim.
One thing that struck me last week when we were talking about this, and when Peter falls to his knees and says, get away from me, I'm a sinner. And then it's after that, right after that, Jesus calls him to follow him. He's ready at that point, because I think what really struck me is, I think that is the point. It's really hitting Peter. Oh my goodness, Jehovah, Yahweh is right here before me, in the flesh. He may not understand it fully, but he knows this is the Lord in my presence. Okay. And he's ready. He'll give up anything to follow now.
Okay. And we'll come back to that. That's the other part of this story that really impresses me and is meaningful to me. It also shows, Luke is also showing what kinds of folks Jesus called. He didn't call the guy who came up to him and said, look, I'm the guy you want, okay? I got lots of friends, I got influence, I'm a great speaker, okay? I know how to communicate. You need to use me. I mean, he called folks who realized they were unholy, okay? Folks who were not part of the religious establishment. Not the folks that certainly that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law expected Jesus to call. Whenever the Messiah did show up, they thought they were first in line. And so this story kind of gives us a little background and a peek into the kinds of folks that Jesus called. And again, just to underscore, you talked about it last week, and Jim mentioned it again here, is this idea that we see throughout Scriptures is that when man comes into the presence of God, or into the presence of even someone who is holy and righteous, there is almost a recoiling. There is a, you're not like me, okay? And as we continue in the Gospel of Luke and we look at the struggle that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law had with their own self-righteousness, it serves as a great warning for us because we do so many of the right things. We're here on Sunday morning, we sing all of the songs, we take the Lord's Supper, we're even here on Wednesday night. And so it's easy for this idea that, well, I know I'm a sinner and I know that I'm saved by grace, but we maybe unconsciously can let slip in this idea that, well, I'm not like that guy over there, and, I've got some things figured out. And this idea that we're dealing with the presence of God, a holiness that we can't even approach, and a righteousness that when we're around it makes us uncomfortable because we realize how different that we are than that. And this is a magnificent story about that. Going back to this idea about calling them, and it wasn't this sort of magic, zombie kind of thing where they just got up and followed him. I guess 2 weeks ago, you probably came to the first class you've ever come to that used an allusion to Mark Herman and NCIS. Okay, tonight I'm going to get my science fiction geeks. And who in here has read the book Dune? Okay, anybody in here read Dune? Okay, I know there's got to be some. Jim, I can't believe you haven't read Dune.
I saw the movie.
Okay, all right. How many have heard of Dune? Okay, all right. What's it about? That's maybe the hardest question I'm going to ask tonight. Okay, the easy answer is it's about these giant behemoth worms and this stuff called blue spice. Okay, all right, Matt, what else? What do you got?
It's about a faith Messiah.
Okay, about a faith Messiah. And that's a theme that runs through, and I bring this all up, and I'm going to try to cut to the chase really quick, Judge, I promise. There is this theme that runs through where the main character, a guy by the name of Paul, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Atreides, has this ability that I don't think any other male, and certainly no other person of his generation has, and that is the ability to use his voice in a way so that he can make people do stuff. And to me, the most interesting part of that whole series of books is how that theme is developed and the time when he decides that, okay, I'm going to say this thing this way because I want this result and I can make this result happen. I don't think that's what Jesus did here. Okay? Jesus spoke with authority. Okay? In the beginning was the Word. I mean, we could get really deep theologically, here with some of this stuff. But I want to keep it simple, mainly because I confuse myself. But this idea of how things are said we're going to visit several times in the next few chapters. And I think we can even visit it here in this incident with Peter that maybe sheds it in a little different light. And let's do it this way. Peter's been fishing all night. He hasn't caught anything. Okay? And he's not trolling with his Bassmaster, sitting there, with his cooler and having snacks. And I mean, he and his friends are laboring. And they're throwing that heavy net and they're pulling it up, and nothing is happening. No fish. Let's do it again. No fish. And when Jesus finds them, what are they doing? The crowd has come around Jesus. He wants the boat, and what does it say that they are doing?
Cleaning the net. They're done.
How much fun is it to clean a giant heavy fishing net at all? But at the end of a night when you've been fishing and nothing's been happening, what kind of mood are you in?
You're not in the mood to toss it back in the water and try again once it got clean.
Okay. You are not in a good mood. What's that? Okay, all right. You're probably muttering to yourself, I don't know why I do this. I'm going to sell this. I'm going to sell this boat, and I'm not going to follow Jesus. I'm going to sell this boat, and I'm going to go, get a job in the city or something. But you are not in a good mood. And Jesus comes up to you and says, hey, I want your boat. I want you to go out, and I want you to throw your nets. Okay? He said, after he got through speaking, okay, he takes the boat, he does the speaking, and he says, put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Master, we've worked all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets. How many different ways can we read that statement? The exact same words. 100 trillion. Okay, more than one, maybe not 100 trillion, okay? Orlando.
Yeah, I was going to say that. All right, Master, because you said.
Okay.
Everybody heard that, right?
Online folks didn't.
Yeah, I think they could have had like a little bit of sarcasm in their voice when they were saying it, probably feeling like, because they're tired and they're probably feeling a little bit exasperated at this point.
Okay. They're exasperated. They have seen and heard teaching and seen stuff that he's done. So this idea of calling him master is not so far-fetched. But I'm not necessarily convinced as, master, because you say so. I don't think he said it that way.
I kind of think it's more of, he's saying it's sarcastic, but in the way reminding himself, okay, why does he have to come around now?
Okay.
It's like, yes, master, you're well known. There's a lot of people here, so I got to do what you say.
Okay. All right. How embarrassing is it going to be in front of these folks to go out?
Why did you come now?
Go out and do this? Okay. While you're going back there to Renee, any of you ever had a boss that you couldn't be sarcastic to, but you wanted to? You just didn't feel like doing what it was they want. I think we're starting to get to the essence of how these guys maybe were feeling when Jesus asked them to do that. Renee?
It's interesting that they led with the excuse.
Okay.
They didn't say we'll let down even though we've worked all night. They started with, listen, we've been working all night. You just came on the scene here. And you don't know how much we've already done before you got here.
Okay. Interesting. I had an employee who worked for me who I came to understand that no matter what I asked him to do, that I first had to wade through about 3 or 4 reasons why it wouldn't work. I can't do it that way. We don't have time to do that. It was never, why don't we do it this way instead? It might help. It was, I just don't know. And so I learned to wade through those, and I would let him go through all of them and say, okay, well, that's fine, but I still, this is what I want you to do. And it'd be fine, and go do it and do a great job. But I had to wade through that stuff first. There is a part of our human nature that wants to, okay, Master, you know, we've done this all night, but because you say so, we'll go do it. There was another hand, or maybe I hit that. So he does it. They have the catch, and we're about done with this, and we're going to move on to the next story or the next incident. But just the astounding nature of this, and what it spoke to Peter and to John and the others that were there about Jesus' authority, moved them so much. It was so astounding that Peter's reaction was, "Get away from me. You're too holy for me." Okay? Just, you know, meditating on that makes this a really profound story that I'm glad Luke told us, and helps us to understand that Jesus deliberately called folks, but he picked folks whose hearts were ready, as somebody mentioned, and that it wasn't the folks that you might expect. We're going to look at another incident now, and chapter 5 is really interesting. There is so much stuff in here. There are really 4 incidents in chapter 5, and I'm going to give you a sneak preview, and I'm going to give you some homework that we may not get to for a couple weeks, but that's okay because it's hard, okay? We have the miraculous catch of fishes, or the calling of the disciples. We have the healing of the leper. We have Jesus healing a paralytic, one of the most well-known stories that we look at. And then we have Jesus going to Levi's house. There's something that ties these stories together that's not real obvious. And I want you to be thinking about what that might be. And I'm going to give you a hint. It's 2 separate words. One of them starts with a P and ends in a Y. And the other word starts with an A and ends in an H. Okay? I told you it was hard. Okay? One of the words, and I'm going to tell you which one, is 8 letters long, and the other word is 9 letters long. Okay?
You expect me to remember all this in a couple of weeks?
Okay. Well, he thinks he already knows it. What? No, you can't buy a vowel. And I just want you, you know, we may not get back to this for a couple of weeks, but the simple thing is, as we look at these incidents, what is it maybe that ties all these things together? Or is it at least a common element in each of the incidents? Okay, with that, let's look at the second one, the man with leprosy. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." And Jesus reached out his hands and touched the man. "I'm willing," he said, "be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him. Then Jesus ordered him, "Don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing, as a testimony to them." Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Start in the middle of this, and then we'll work our way back. Why is it that Jesus told this guy to go show himself to the priest?
That's what the law required.
Okay, that's the easy Sunday school answer. Okay, go ahead and say it into the mic, and it's right.
That's
okay?
what the law required.
Okay, the law required. If you had a disease and you thought that you were cured of it, go show yourself to the priest, and he's the one who could declare you to be clean.
Well, the Bible says because that it would be a testimony to them.
Okay, a testimony to them. Okay. Got another one down here. Karen.
I was thinking that it was because he came to teach, and by them telling more about him, he was unable to teach as much because they were coming for their own needs of being healed.
Okay, all right. What do you know about leprosy?
Contagious.
Contagious? What's the prognosis? Okay, not good. How often do you suppose people went to the priest and say, hey, look, my leprosy went away? Okay. That's the picture that we've sort of presented in Sunday school over the years about leprosy. And indeed, there was a form of leprosy that was basically meant you were walking dead. You were dead. Okay? But there were a number of diseases that looked like leprosy but weren't necessarily leprosy. And you might recover from those. Okay? I don't think that command was in the law because there were so many folks going around doing miraculous healings of people with leprosy that that's what they needed to do. It was a condition, and it might be such, and if you had anything that looked like it, you needed to separate yourself because it was deadly and it was highly contagious. Okay? But there were things that looked like it that could get well on their own. And you would go to the priest and say, yeah, it's gone, you're fine, you're good, you don't have to separate yourself anymore. So it's, in one sense, it's a very logical question and a logical thing for Jesus to do, to tell this guy to do that. It's also consistent with what the law said, and Jesus came to fulfill the law, not to short-circuit it. Okay? As most of you know, Teresa and I have recovered this last week from COVID. And I think over the last 2 or 3 years, this idea of separating yourself when you're not healthy, we understand maybe in a way that we didn't before. Think about back to 2019 when folks started getting sick and folks started dying from this. And you're in a crowd and somebody starts coughing. We're still that way. You know, if we're sitting around, they start sniffling, they start coughing, they start showing. It's like, man, I got to get away from that. And for some folks, that kind of exposure was deadly. Okay? And if you think about the aversion that we developed to even being around crowds and separating ourselves even when we were perfectly healthy, we began to get a glimpse of a disease that had no cure. You know, I got on Paxlovid, Teresa already had some, and I got on it, as soon as I tested positive, and, we knocked that thing out. But it was there. There was no, if you had the deadly stuff, there was no cure. And so you didn't want any chance or any opportunity to catch that sort of thing. And I think maybe we understand a little bit of that fear and that aversion and that necessity of separating ourselves. Now, there are a couple of folks from my Monday night Bible study here, so they can't answer this question. We all know that folks who had leprosy were supposed to separate themselves and cover themselves and go unclean, unclean when anybody approached. How far away did they stay? Anybody got an idea? I had somebody in my group nail it. Okay, so pressure's on. What is that?
I just remember it was outside the city gates. I don't remember a distance.
Okay.
But.
We're going to read over about in chapter 18 or 19 or something about some folks calling off from a long distance. Is there anything in the law that defined how far apart or how far away they were supposed to stay? And the answer is no. There's not a definition in the law. I did find a reference that said that the practice in Jesus' day was for lepers to stay about 50 yards away. Okay, so think about a football, half a football field. Okay, so when we get over to Luke 18 and 19 and we hear about these folks calling from a long distance, you got to have some lungs to, to pull that off. Knowing that, what strikes you about this story and what this leper does? What's that? Well, that he touched it, but
That he
before he
touched
even
him.
touched, that's what Jesus did, and we'll talk about that in a second. What did the leper do? Was he 50 yards away? This guy ran to him and fell at his feet. I'd like to have seen the expression on Peter and John and James, and I like to see the expression on their faces. This guy gets closer and closer. Wonder if they started backing up. I don't have a sense that Jesus backed up a step. But this guy is unclean, legally required to separate himself, and he violates that. What does that tell us about him? Desperate. Okay. There is no cure for this stuff, but I've either seen or maybe just heard, because I've had to keep at a distance, about what this guy has been doing. And what is his question when he comes to Jesus? If you're willing. Why would he ask that?
He didn't ask if you can.
Okay?
He asked
It
if you're-
wasn't if you can.
Right.
Okay? And
So he apparently had faith that Jesus could do it.
okay. All right. Wasn't if you can, but it was if you're willing.
It might have been an expression of his unworthiness or
Okay?
perception that he perhaps might not be worthy
Okay.
of such a gift.
Okay. I think there's two aspects. There's one, his I'm pretty pitiful. I don't look pretty. I'm pretty grotesque, perhaps. And I'm not worthy of this. But the other part of it is, Jesus is being recognized as a rabbi and a teacher. Okay? And what would the normal reaction of, say, a Pharisee be if a leper came up, running up to him and fell at his feet? What are you doing? You diseased whatever, get away from me. Okay, so sometimes we build up in our mind what religious folks are supposed to act like. And maybe this guy had, anybody know what the word Pharisee means? We call them all the time, but do you know what the word means? The separate ones. Okay. And as we're going to see, and as I think we've talked in here before, Pharisees didn't want to have anything to do with anybody, because everybody but them was unclean and unfit for anything spiritual. And unless they somehow figured out a way to be like them and do the stuff that they're doing, the Pharisees even had a separate entrance into the temple built so they wouldn't have to mingle with common folks when they went to the temple. So this idea of this guy coming up and saying, if you're willing, is just, here is a spiritual holy man, and he's not like anything else that's out there. And so if you can, you can make me well. I wonder if he knew the story of Naaman. Naaman's the only other person I can think of off the top of my head that got healed miraculously of leprosy like that, other than what Jesus did. But this is a pretty... we see these stories about Jesus healing folks, and after a little while, oh yeah, it's another healing. He did it. Yeah. But they're all wondrous, life-changing events that there was nothing like around. And so this guy comes up and says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. Okay, before he even said, I can, the first thing he does is touch him. Yes, sir.
In the translation that you have, does it pose it as a question or just a statement?
It's as a statement, but it's like a question. It's, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And it goes to what Renee said about he wasn't asking, if you can. It's like, Lord, if you're willing, you can do it. And that's a good point. It was a declarative statement, not a, yeah. It's like, I hope you're willing to do it for me, not, I hope you can do it for me. Okay. Yes, sir.
So basically, I mean, the way I look at it as he was showing like a sign of faith.
Sure,
He
absolutely.
just came out and said, hey, it ain't that I don't think you can't do it, but if you will,
Okay.
I know you can do it.
Okay, and when we get to the next story about the guy being let from the roof, we're going to read again about Jesus seeing his friend's faith, okay, which is another interesting topic when we get there. But let's go back to, Chris brought it up first, is the first thing that Jesus does is he touches him. So what? Why does that matter?
Who's touched him?
Okay, when's the last time anybody touched him? Except maybe some other disease, grotesque person that, he kind of recoiled from. Okay. So you just didn't do that. Okay. Yeah, Chris?
Well, I think it's amazing that he touched him and everybody saw that. That would not be what anybody would do. But the other thing is, I think it's because Jesus was fearless. He had no doubt that this thing was not going to affect him because he was in charge.
Okay. Matt?
So he touched him before the leprosy left the man. We just read that Jesus didn't perform any miracles for himself in the desert. So are we looking at this like, yes, Jesus had compassion on the man, but Jesus also put himself at risk? If he's taking the stance of, I'm not going to perform miracles for myself, what happens if Jesus got leprosy, right?
I think a couple thoughts. One is he's already been healing folks. This is not his first miraculous healing. Okay, so I don't think he's questioning whether he has the power or not. I think it has to do with, how do I want to say this? Well, let me say it this way. Did Jesus have to touch him to heal him? No. We know from other passages, you go home, by the time you get home, your servant's going to be well. That wasn't an issue. He didn't touch the paralytic who's let down through the roof in the next instant. Touching was independent of the healing. And to me, it speaks to Jesus' compassion. Mm-hmm. He also was violating the law. Okay? By the law, he was becoming unclean when he touched him. Of course, it's kind of hard to say you're not clean when you heal the guy afterwards. How can you say he's unclean? Okay, so we don't see anybody arguing with him about that. But he is, and we're going to see this more and more through Luke, he came to fulfill the law, but the things that people made up, or the ways that people were legalistic, or the ways that people got around having a heart for God and still said that they were going by the law, he was fearless in the face of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think he was afraid of catching it. I don't think he was afraid of what people were going to say. I don't think he was, it's just, here's a guy who hasn't been touched, and my heart goes out to him. And we see this over and over in Luke. One of the commentaries that I'm looking at talks about this as being the gospel, Luke as being the gospel of compassion, because it shows up so much in the things that he said. Mike?
I was thinking, there was the healing where the woman just touched his cloak, and he's like, "Who touched me?" There's a crowd around.
Yeah, you're
But
about
this one,
eight chapters ahead of us.
yeah, but well, it happens. But
They won't remember.
but this guy, this was like the room cleared when this guy came in.
Okay.
When he fell at Jesus' feet, they weren't dragging him away.
Okay.
They all took off. So this was very visible, this touch.
Okay.
A lot of people, if it was in the crowd, like he didn't, when the woman reached out and touched the garment, nobody knew who did it
Okay.
until she said it was her. But this is, a lot of people saw that. And it's like, just made me think of, current days. Remember way back, and they put it in all the shows, Princess Diana went into an AIDS ward, sat on the bed, and touched the guy.
Okay.
And that was like, that hit the news. And
Okay.
that's exactly what this was. I mean, the miracle where people talking about, he touched a guy with a leper, and he healed it. Did he healed a leper, or did they say he touched a leper
Okay.
and healed him? I mean,
Okay.
sort of that touch is a big symbol.
Yeah.
Saying someone touched someone is, I think it wouldn't have had the impact if you just healed them. I think it was, for everyone to see,
Certainly, I think it gave more impact to what he was doing. I'm not sure how big a crowd was there.
Yeah, I don't know.
It doesn't say it's in it. We're going to, in the next instance, there are folks, crowding around, kind of as a result of this story, because Jesus says, "Don't you go tell people. I don't want you to tell people about this." Okay? But he did. He did. If nothing else, what are you doing here? I thought you had leprosy, and it's like, well, no. Well, what happened? You're gonna tell it. Yeah, Orlando.
I also feel this was like a show of acceptance and
Yes.
authority
Yes.
at the same time. Because for him to defy the law, it really was showing that he is the law, which wasn't the teachings that they were getting yet, but he was able to clearly put out some clear points,
Okay.
like you're saying, it's like he healed them. And that's all people could really say about that afterwards.
Your mama wants to talk.
You defined the Pharisees as separate. And to me, the point is that he has come to do something different. His whole ministry, his whole purpose was to do something different because they were no longer following God's ways. And he came to set that back on the straight path.
All right, great point. We need to wrap it up here. You've probably talked through in other classes about why did Jesus not tell him to tell anybody? And to me, the simple answer is it's not time yet. One, it's not going to stop him from doing it, okay? Because he can't help but do it. But it's not. There's a timing, and there's a sequence to things that are supposed to happen and that need to happen first. And it's not. People are going to find out, because we see at the end of this section it says, "Yet the news about him," verse 15, "spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." Luke mentions Jesus withdrawing to lonely places and praying and prayer more than any of the other Gospels. It was a characteristic that Luke noted that Jesus did. He wasn't like the Pharisees. Okay? Yes, he separated himself, but it was to go off and to pray so that he could come back and serve, not to put himself on a pedestal and, you can just hope that you are as good as me, which is what the Pharisees had did. Okay, we're going to stop there. Your homework for next week. There's a very, very familiar story about the paralytic being let down through the roof. You know the story. And in verse 22, when the Pharisees start thinking, who's this guy think he is? Jesus knows what they're thinking, and he says, "Why are you thinking these things in your heart? Which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven, or to say get up and walk? So your homework for next week is to come back in with an answer to that question. Which one is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or get up and walk? When you start thinking about it, it's a strange question. Which one's easier, and why did he ask that question? And we will discuss that next week. Thank you so much for your comments. It's been a great class. Let's close in a prayer. God, again, we're just so grateful for your word and having opportunities to study it. And we can look at the same verses that we looked at last week, and there's another whole lesson in there. And we thank you for the depth and the riches of your word. We thank you for Jesus, his authority, his example, his compassion, and that he is our way to be able to approach you. Help us to have a healthy sense of who we are and who you are, to not despair or to give up or to be bitter or to think that we've got it figured out in the other direction. But God, help us to understand that you're holy and that any holiness that we have comes through you. Thank you for your Son and his sacrifice, the ability to pray to you now. Bless us as we leave here. Give us a safe trip home, good rest tonight. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.